All praises to the Most High for another day. Blessings to all the 12 tribes of Israel and to all the Gentiles that will cleave into the house of Jacob. Thank you for joining us today. Today we will continue to read the book of Remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Hagi, chapter 6, tablet of Seth, the story of Yatzakad and Kava, an account of the birth of baby Kenneth and of the first temptation. And it came to pass that Enoch looked on these things with joy, for he beheld the innocence and purity of his first parents, and he knew that he had viewed the conditions in which evils would arise in their inception, and his desire to understand the nature of evil was before him, for he was urgent that the righteous would come to an understanding of evil, so they could safeguard against it. And when he beheld that it would be through the motherhood of Kava that Semihaza would first find entry, he cried out to the Lord, and he said, Lord, please show me how evil and sin and waywardness first found a way into the lives of your children. And the Lord said, Look, my son, and learn compassion, and also learn the meaning of life, so you may bless your first parents with understanding, yet while they live, and in this way you can comfort them and bring them to their day of joy in their deliverance from the shadow of the mystery of these things. And Enoch looked, and he beheld his first parents once again in the valley where they first met, and it was in the third season of fruit after their marriage, toward evening. And Kava was sitting upon a rock in the brook where they first met, and she putting her feet into the water, and they had named the way of the river the valley of Simcha, which is to say, the valley of rejoicing. But after Mattaniah was slain there, it came to be called the valley of Joash. And as she sat there, there was a streak of burning to be seen in the sky, and she could see it was coming near to where she sat, and with a loud crash and the breaking of limbs, a stone of heaven fell from the sky, and it landed on the northeast side of the river, which was known by them as the side of the river of Yatzakad, for that is where he was when Kava first saw him. And it was a loud intrusion, and it brought violence to the oak trees and to the hills. And Kava was afraid, and she screamed, and never before had Eden heard the sound of it. And her scream penetrated into the heart of Yatzakad, and the tranquility of Eden was shattered. And Kava ran all the way to the place where they dwelt, weeping as she went, and she was afraid in Eden in the presence of God. And when this event happened, Yatzakad was upon the brow of a hill overlooking the stream, and he was eating the fruit of a cherry tree, and from where he sat he saw the stone fall from heaven, and he heard Kava scream, and saw her flee, and he saw the smoke of burning, and his heart leapt within him, and he made haste, and ran to be with Kava, and the two of them were afraid together, and they saw the smoke and glow of burning arising from the northeast in the darkness of the evening sky, and immediately they set out to go to the southwest, away from the smoke. And Kava took with her only her wedding grass, and they abandoned their resting place, and they took their journey in haste, and stopped along the way as they went to catch their breath from their much haste. And they looked back as if they felt they were being pursued, and in their hearts they did not know the meaning of that which had transpired. And it came to pass that they stopped for the night, and the moon was full, and they saw that as they went downward towards the fields of the plain, the trees began to grow thinner, and the cedar trees began to appear, and the presence of Kai in the soft light of the night brought them comfort. And when the light of the day came, their fears were gone, and they continued on their way, even for the space of 3 days' journey. And when the sun was high on the third day, they were able to look downward to the southwest, and the vastness of the earth lay before them, and in the misty distance lay the grasslands of Enoch, and they extended to what appeared to them to be the ends of the earth. And it came to pass that as they viewed this new sight, they desired not to venture forth into regions that had no trees. And Enoch beheld that they felt protection coming from the trees, which thing they had never felt a need of before. And they were beholding from the top of a very long sloping hill, looking towards the southwest. And after viewing this wondrous new scene, they began to earnestly desire to find a place to dwell. And Kava cast her eyes about, and she discovered a large rock bluff off in the distance to their north. And the rocks called out to her, and in her heart she was drawn towards the comfort of the rocks of the earth. And it came to pass that they turned themselves in their journey, and they went towards the rocks of the bluff. And as they drew closer, they could see that on the side of the bluff, near the bottom, there was a cavity in the rock, and there was a stream just below, and two large sentinel oak trees, one on each side of the cavity in the rock. And Kava urged upon Yatsaka to go there. And when they came around the corner, it was towards evening, and as they looked, they saw a glow coming from the base of one of the sentinel trees. And as they looked, they saw Enoki waiting for them there. And the sight of him caused all of their longings to flee, and they ran to him, for they loved him dearly. And as they approached, he smiled upon them, and they approached him gently and said, Father, we are so glad to see you in this place. We have been driven forth from where we were by something loud and terrible that fell from the sky, and we were pursued with fear. Father, who is that came out of the heavens to pursue us in this manner? And before he could answer, Kava said, whatever it was, it is friend to no one, and it is not joined to creation, Ayatakat said. And Father, there is nothing that can be known about it for you to enter into it to give it life. And the joy of life is not present any longer in our resting place. And the Lord said to them quietly, this is a good place for you to dwell now. What fell to the earth was a stone that flew in the midst of the heavens, and his name is Mozar the Decadent, for he is a rock that is fallen into decay, and he thinks he is God. And the Lord smiled upon them, and he touched them, and he said, be not afraid, for I am here with you. And he took them each by the hand, and they walked together towards the cavity of the rock. And there before the grandeur of the evening sunset, they spoke together of happy things. And when it was dark, the Lord lay down beside them, and they slept, each one laying their head on one of his arms. And when it began to be light, Enoki awoke them. And after they had stirred themselves, he said, tomorrow is the first celebration of tranquility. For tomorrow in the night the rocks of Ebedel will move in their strength to descend upon the valley of Simca with their spirits, to suppress Mozart the Decadent. So today we shall prepare. Come, let us discover what is to be seen over the way across the stream. And they went happily together like a father and his children, and Kava sang and danced in the way before them. And there in an open grassy place they discovered a sebe grown in abundance in clumps here and there, and a sebe is known to be wheat, and it was golden colored, and it was very delightful to behold it gently swaying in the wind. And it came to pass that the Lord Enoki walked over, and he sat himself down upon the earth, and he began to strip off the tops of the sebe into the lap of the cloak of his garment. And Yatsakat and Kava did not know what he was doing, but they began to do the same, and they loved doing this with their father, and he showed them how to roll it between the palms of their hands within the cloak of their garments to remove the grain. And thus the wheat was obtained by using the palms of their hands, which feel the power of God to deliver one from their fears. And thus they separated the wheat from the tares. And he showed them how to bounce the sebe up so the wind could blow the chaff away. And it came to pass, the Yatsakat and Kava were filled with delight, and they labored together with joy, And after they had gathered sufficient asib, they ran happily back to the cavity of the rock, and their behavior was innocent and childlike, a man and his wife. And it came to pass that after they drank and rested themselves, the Lord pointed up above the rocks of the bluff at a flock of sheep, and he stepped out into the open, and he called out to the sheep, and they came running and bounding as they went. And the sheep came to them, and they milled about. And it came to pass that the Lord had some kind of a clay container, which is called a kelly, and it is oval, being 1½ times as long as it is wide, and the length of it on top was the length of the hand of a man, and also it was the length of the hand of a man in his height of it, and the bottom of it was 3 fingers long, and it was also oval in the same manner. And it came to pass that the Lord walked over to the sheep that had young, and he sat himself down upon the ground with his legs folded under, and putting one of the hind legs of the sheep over one knee, and lifting it up, he milked the sheep. And he drew the milk of the sheep into the kelly until it looked about half full, and Kava and Yatakar looked on, being up very close, for they had great interest. And after thanking the sheep, he arose, and they went down to the side of the stream, and there in a hollow place in a stone he ground the asib into flour, and he put it little by little into the milk in the kelly. And Kava was moved with much excitement, and she wanted to grind flour too, and the two of them ground flour together. And when they were done, Enoki said, "Mix the flour into dough." And he sat upon the ground with his legs folded under, and he kneaded the dough upon his lap. And Kava watched all of this from up very close, and she watched with much fascination, and I saw her eating honeycomb. And when Enoki said it was done, he placed the dough in the kelly, and he looked upon his work with satisfaction. And pointing to the dough, Kava said, "Father, what is it?" And he said, "It is called lechem," or that is to say, bread. And he said, "Watch." And he put the kelly into the coals of a fire, and he banked up the coals of the fire with a stick around the bottom of it until it would remain upright. And by the heat of the coals the bread swelled up to be round on the top. And then he banked up the kelly to the top edge with coals, and he put a piece of bark over the top, and left it to cook, and the bark burned off around the edges, and the bread rose upwards and cracked open. And when it was done, Enoki said, drew the coals gently away from one side with a stick, and he laid the kelly over on the side of it, and the bread fell loose. And the Lord sat the bread upside down upon a stone, and Kava watched him up very close, getting in his way. And she looked at him to see what he would do with it. And he said, "It is for eating." And he broke off a piece with his fingers. And he said, "When you break bread, it will sweep away all the effects that come by the presence of Mozar the Decadent. For inside the bread is the breath that is in me, and it gives life to the bread. And the breaking of bread will bring to birth the spirit of life which quenches fear." And Enoch saw that breaking bread was the first element of righteousness given to man to protect them and to push back against the effects of the presence of evil. And Mozar the Decadent looked upon the kelly as a weapon that was formed against him, and Enoch knew that in the heart of the evil one there was delight when man cut bread. And he counseled Lamech to use his knife in this way. And it seems certain the intentions of the evil one in cutting bread is to lessen the effects of this element of righteousness, to be a weapon for use against him. And Enoch beheld that the shape of the bread was shaped like a shield of righteousness, and I saw it to resemble the shape of the smoke of the worship of God that is to be seen on the heavenly tablets. And any kind of bread should not be cut in any manner by the righteous. And it came to pass that in these things Yatakar and Kava saw that their father had taught them how to protect themselves from fear, so that it could not pursue them. And he revealed to them how to bring to birth the presence of Kai when they have need. And as Kai is the one who gives life to all things, and they dearly loved their kind father. And after those days, Kava made bread often, and from that day they began to call the sheep, and the sheep followed them, and Kava loved the sheep. And much love passed between the sheep and our first parents, and the feelings of fear and dread that came from the presence of Mozar passed like a dream in the night, and he became to them as any other rock upon the hillside. And it came to pass that in those days an exceedingly curious thing began to take place, for Kava began to have possessions. For she went to the side of the brook, and she exclaimed to Yatsakad, pointing to the stone upon which the Lord had ground a seed, and she said, "This stone is mine, and I want it brought to our dwelling place." And she tried to lift it, and she had the kelly and the grass from the wedding, and the cavity of the rock, and the mossy place, and the sheep were seen by Yatsakad to belong to her. And he stood in amazement when she pointed to the grindstone and said, "This is mine." And it brought great peace and comfort to him that she should have possessions, and their dwelling place smelt like bread and felt like home, and Kava became the dwelling place for Yatsakad. And Enoch knew that a woman with righteous possessions is the home the Lord intended for man, yet Yatsakad had no possessions, and he was well satisfied. And in those days our beloved first parents were happy in Eden, and the song of the dance was heard to resound there. And Yatsakad made a good place for the grinding stone and the fire, and Kava gathered moss for a bed, and she made a little trench with a stick beside the stones of the cavity in the rock, so that when the water seeped out, it would run there and keep their dwelling place dry. And she made a place to keep the kelly, so she could have it beside her when she slept, and she would reach out in the night to touch it, and thank Enoki said in her heart for his kindness. And the righteousness of her possessions brought the Lord comfort, and it could be seen that she cooked nothing else in the kelly except bread, and she always did it in the manner which she was taught. And it came to pass in the course of those days, the Lord also taught them to eat fish, and they roasted them over a fire, and the fish magnified the feelings of friendship and joining in the heart of Kava, and they gave her the feelings that she was secure in her womanhood. And Yatsakad provided her with all things according to her righteous desires, and the charity of Kava was shed abroad in the richness of it, and all Eden was brought to comfort, and the memory of her scream was gone. And they ate honeycomb and nuts and berries and fruit of every kind, and they ate green herbs, and they chewed on the roots of the kennereed, and they sucked out the sweetness from the inside of it. And it came to pass that one day Kava arose, and she saw Yatsakad drinking from the little pool that formed from the water that seeped out beside the stones of their dwelling place. And she said, "The sheep, the fish, and the Essene are our friends. How many other friends are we to find here in this place?" And as she looked about, she espied a serpent emerging out of a crack in the rocks over by where she cooked, and it had a very sweet face, and it was very delightful to look upon. And the serpent sashayed from side to side as she walked, for she walked upon legs, and she loved the water that seeped by the cooking place, and she drank the water. And she was iridescent blue and green, and sometimes seemed to be red, when the light of the sun shone upon her. And the serpent was very curious to look into the kelly, and she walked all around it and looked upon it, and she is called a rock serpent. And Enoch saw that the rock serpent and Kava became fast friends, and she sang and danced before the serpent, and the serpent began to visit her at the same time each day to get a drink and watch her make bread and to hear the song of the dance. And Kava knew when to expect the serpent to emerge from the crack in the rocks of her dwelling, and they would talk about everything together, and their friendship was very pleasing to Yatsakad, for he delighted in the joy of his rib. And it came to pass that one day Kava discovered that her dance was in the same manner to sashay like the serpent, and it was a dance to express the happiness of her joining in rich friendship with creation and all the souls in Eden. And in those days Yatsakad and Kava were happy, and they continued their life as husband and wife in Eden. And it came to pass that after a while, because the bread dispelled the feelings that came by the effects of the presence of Mozar the Decadent, Kava no longer thought of him, nor did she feel any fear, neither did she bring such things to mind. And one day Kava said to Yatsakad, "Let us return to visit the place where we were married, for I am well acquainted with the rocks there, and I desire to tell them about my friends in this place." And the serpent was seen to be listening to these words of Kava. And it came to pass that they arose up and set themselves out to journey the way they had come, and they went upwards towards the northwest until the forest grew thicker, and finally they arrived at the place where they had first met and given gifts to each other. And Ebedel greeted them with kindness, and Kayal was delighted to see them again, and her waters rose up to be sweet to the mouth of Yatsakad, and the moss was still there. And after Yatsakad drank from the fountain, he laid himself down on the moss and went to sleep. And Kava went happily down to the river and told all the elders of Ebedel about the sheep and the Essene, and the sounds of joy issued forth out of them. And then she told them about the serpent, and what a delight she was to visit with each day. And the rocks answered her not a word, nor made a sound. And she wondered about their silence. She cast her eyes about, and her gaze fell upon the broken trees and burn marks that were at the place where the stone from heaven landed, and it was the only broken and burnt trees she had ever seen. And when she gazed on this scene, she remembered Mozar, the rock that fell into decay. And because the bread had dispelled the effects of his presence so thoroughly, she thought in the innocence of her heart that perhaps he had traveled on and gone to another place, and she thought to go across the river and look where he had landed. And in her heart she was hesitant, but all of the birds were singing, and the trees swayed with the wind happily, and only the rocks were quieted. So she decided to go over and look, and she went carefully across the river on one stone after another, and she approached the place where the stone of heaven burst upon Eden, and she ventured ahead to peek timidly between the branches of a bush. And Mozar was still there, and he shone forth in the light of the sun, and he was iridescent blue and green, and sometimes to be red in the light of the sun, and he seemed very peaceful just lying there. But Ebedel knew he was lying in wait like a predator to catch his prey. And as Kava beheld him with her eyes, she gasped and covered her cheeks with her hands, for she beheld him to look like the serpent in her appearance. And Mozar looked the way he did because he had been burned with fire, and she could tell he came from very far away, for there were no other rocks like him in Eden, and he was beautiful to look upon. And it came to pass that as she looked upon him, an owl called her name, and suddenly fear seized upon her once again, and she remembered the day and how she felt when Mozar landed, and she turned herself and made haste to go, and she ran to the river, and she kept looking behind her as though she was being pursued, and she arriving weeping and breathless to where Yatsakad was sleeping. And he awoke and saw her looking back as if she was being pursued, but there was nothing there. And Yatsakad held her to comfort her, and she rehearsed to him all that had transpired, and she told him that it was very curious how the rocks of Eden were silent towards her when she told them of the serpent. And after a while Yatsakad said, "I sense a division. We are never to visit this place again, for surely this division will displease." Enoki said, and all the rocks that had been their resting place that day were ashamed before all of their fellows in Eden for the behavior of Mozar the Decadent. And it came to pass that Yatsakad and Kava left again with the feeling that they were being pursued, and they never during their long lives returned to the fountain of Simca. And it came to pass that when they arrived home, it seemed to them that their dwelling place was a haven from the fear that came from Mozar, and they were comforted once again by the bread that Kava made. And Yatsukad went with a troubled heart to inquire of Kai, and he prayed to the Lord mightily, and he said, "O Enoki said, I am afraid we will displease you. Please help me to understand why there is a division among the rocks of the earth concerning my rib," when she mentioned the serpent to the rocks of Simca. And the Lord said, by the voice of Kai, "The one who calls himself Samihaza, who is Mozar, is the first in all of creation to be viewed by your wife, to be naked, for he is not clothed upon in righteousness, and nakedness is akin to the absence of life, which is called death. And his appearance does not glorify me, but his appearance is become the means for him to show forth his own glory, and he uses his appearance and countenance to become a life unto himself that is separate from me. So be very careful, my son, to avoid that which is not clothed upon in righteousness." Now, in those days, Mozar began to speak to the rocks around him concerning the visit of Kava. And by the time Yatsukad and Kava had returned home, the controversy of Mozar had spread all throughout Eden, and the rock serpent heard stories of grandeur, how she had the appearance of the famous rock that came down from heaven. And the effect of this division between the rocks of Eden lay very heavily upon Kava, because in her soul her vision was to be joined with the rocks of the earth, and because of her, in the beginning, all the rocks of the earth spoke with one voice. And the rock serpent was well apprised of the account of Kava in her return to view Mozar, and he was much puffed up that she should return to look upon him. And the countenance of the serpent was thus changed towards Kava, for she glorified herself to be viewed in the same manner as Mozar, in being beautiful and exotic by Kava, who is the handiwork of the love of God. Now it came to pass that when Kava had returned home, she began to see the serpent with new eyes, and Kava was quiet around her, and every time she beheld the serpent, Mozar would come to mind. But she spoke very kindly to the serpent, and in a way quite reserved, and the serpent began to be reserved in her manner also. And it came to pass that in those days Yatsukad and Kava were happy, and they passed through the events in their lives in the richness of Eden, and in the security of their home, and they were also blessed and kept secure with their use of the element of righteousness. But Yatsukad no longer trusted the serpent, yet he was polite. And it came to pass that one day, as Kava was making bread, the rock serpent came out, as it was her custom to drink. And with her she had brought her young, and she had the little serpent by her side, and it was very small, and unsure about the feet of it. And Kava exclaimed in the love of her heart, "It is a baby. Where did you get it?" And the serpent said, "It issued forth out of me, for I am the mother of it." And Kava said, "What shall you do with it?" And the serpent said, "I shall raise it up until it becomes a serpent just like me." And Kava was filled with the joys of delights that her friend should have a young to raise up. And she clapped her hands for joy. And at the sound of her clap, the serpent winced. And she said to Kava, "Who raised you up?" And Kava said, "Why do you ask? Do you not know? Enoki said, raised us up. And he is our father and our protector, and the one who guides us in the way." And the serpent answered her not a word, but turned herself, and went back into the crack in the rocks with her baby. And it came to pass that as I looked with Enoch, I beheld that Kava was arising from her sleep, and noticed that she was becoming heavy with child. And neither Yatsukad nor Kava seemed to take any notice, nor bring to mind anything about what it meant. And it came to pass that one day she woke up Yatsukad by laughing and making exclamations of delight. And when he stirred himself to see what it was all about, she said, "Look and see what I have." He looked at what she held, and he was startled, and he said, "What is it?" And she said, "It is a baby, and it is one of our kind, and it issued forth out of me, just like the young of the serpent, and like all of the animals of the field. Is not it wonderful?" And she held the baby tenderly and with much affection. And the child smiled brightly with the same smile as his mother. And they both laughed and took great delight to hold and look upon the child. And Yatsukar looked upon the child with great wonder. And when the sun was fully up, they arose, and they were excitedly looking at the child in the light of the sun. And Enoki said, came up to them, and he said, "What is it that you have?" And Kava turned to him with her face beaming with delight, and she said, "It is a child, and it issued forth out of me. Is not it wonderful?" And she held the baby out to the Lord. And he, taking the child very tenderly, said, "Oh yes, it is a most wonderful child. You must cover it from the light of the sun." And he kissed the baby, and he handed the child back to her. And as they talked, Kava turned and placed the child in the bosom of her garment to cover it from the light. And then she began to laugh, for the child was nursing. And she said, "The child chews on me and sucks on me, like we do to the kennereed roots." And the Lord said, "It is because, like the kennereed, you are filled with the sweetness of life. We shall call him Kenneth, and that shall be his name, because he is filled with the sweetness of life, in the same manner as his mother. And he is the most delightful thing that has ever happened in Eden." And Yatsukar was standing by to view all of these things, and he said, "Father, where did it come from?" And the Lord said, "You are the father of it, and she is the mother of it, and it came from the two of you together." And Yatsukar said, "What shall we do with it?" And the Lord said, "You shall raise it up unto me, for it is a gift that I have been given, and in turn I have given it to you." And thus was the sun to set on the first day in the life of the child called Kenneth. And it came to pass that Kava made a part of her righteous garment into a sling for a cradle, and she kept little Kenneth cradled near her bosom, or under her arm, at her side, everywhere she went. And he was very little, and she kept him from the light of the sun, as the Lord had said. And it came to pass that some days later, Enoki came to visit them in the morning darkness, and Kava fed the Lord bread. And they sat by the light of the fire, and they all rejoiced together, and spoke of the child, and of all the rich happiness that was theirs. And the Lord said, "I have come this day to hold and bless your child." And Enoki said, gently lifted baby Kenneth out of the cradle of his mother, and held him in his arms. And the Lord dearly loved the child, and he beheld him, using both of his arms across his chest, and bent his head to hover over the child in his arms. And it was as if the Lord surrounded the baby with his soul, and he loved him like a treasure, and thankfulness poured out of the soul of God for the child. And Enoki sang a song that the kennereeds sing when the wind blows gently upon it. And all Eden rejoiced in the singing, and it is a very mild and beautiful song, filled with much tenderness of heart, and the joy of the Lord was full to overflowing. And finally, looking up, Enoki said to Yatsukar and Kava, "It is my desire to sing this song forever." And Kava learned the song, and it is a song that speaks of the joys of the Lord in this child, the only living soul born in Eden, and he was blessed at his birth. And this day is a day to be long remembered. And it came to pass that one day after these events transpired, Kava was singing the song of the kennereed, and she was kneading bread, and little Kenna was in his cradle on her back, and Yatsukar sat by preparing wood for the fire to cook the bread. And the rock serpent emerged from out of the crack in the rock, so she could get a drink. And the child of the serpent was fully grown, and the serpent had not seen, nor did it know about baby Kenna. And Kava brought the baby out to show it to the serpent, and to tell of their great delight to have him. And the serpent said, "Oh, you have a little one. Where did you get it?" And Kava said to the serpent, with the same words that the serpent had said to her. It issued forth out of me, for I am the mother of it. And the serpent said, Who will raise it up? And Kava said, Enoki said, told us that we, Yatsukad and I, we are to raise it up unto him. And the serpent said, Do you know how? And the serpent departed, and they did not know why. But this question brought by the serpent troubled them deeply. And Kava turned to Yatsukad and said, Why am I afraid? I am making bread today. And it came to pass, upon hearing these words, that Yatsukad went out alone to pray. And he said to the Lord, Why, Father, are we both brought to fear by the words of the serpent? And the Lord said, The name of the serpent is called Arum, and she is not now clothed upon in righteousness in the same manner of Mozar the Decadent, for she is busily engaged in pursuing the glory held up before her eyes by him. And his visions for her that are rebellious have become very desirable to her. Thus the serpent is the second thing in Eden to be naked, and you are to see that she comes not any more to the place of water in your abode, for Arum brings there the spirit and the presence of fear to your place of haven. And when Yatsukad returned home, he rehearsed all that the Lord had told him to Kava, and she wept at the loss of her friend. And it came to pass that when the serpent next appeared, Yatsukad said, Get yourself away from here, Arum, and come not near us again. And he cast stones at the serpent, and he invited Kava to also throw stones at her. And she obeyed Yatsukad in all things, but she wept as she cast stones at Arum. And Kava said to Yatsukad, How are we able to raise up this child to be acceptable to the Lord, seeing we do not know how? And how can we be as good at the task of raising up this child as the Lord has been to raise us up, seeing he is the source of all life? Oh, woe is me. And she sighed with heavy sighing. Thank you, family, for joining us today. That was chapter 6 of the book of Remembrance of Enoch, Essene, book of Hagi. Thank you, great Holy One, great Enoki said, for your loving kindness endures forever. Thank you. In the mighty name of Matza the Lamb and Ka'i, the Holy Spirit. So be it. Blessings, family. Shalom.